Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Devin Sears. I'm joined by my friend and colleague, Chris Miles. We are here today to talk about website migrations, specifically if you are an agency and you are migrating your clients' websites. I'm sure most of you tuning in have at one point attempted to migrate a website. Maybe it was successful, maybe there were some bumps you hit along the way, but today we kind of want to talk about how do you do this process if you're dealing with someone that's paying you money to do this process? Oftentimes there's an increased expectation that everything will go seamlessly, everything will go smoothly. And so here today, we're going to kind of deconstruct that whole process and give our tips and tricks on what you can do to make this the easiest process as possible for yourself and by extension, your clients. So before we dive too much into that, as I mentioned, I'm joined by Chris Miles. He's one of our senior product managers. He has migrated hundreds, if not thousands, of websites in his time. And so he's probably ran into many issues that all of us have ran into and solved most of them himself as well. So we're thrilled to have him join us today, thrilled to have his experience and his guidance as he walks us through this. So before we jump into the content, I do want to touch on a couple housekeeping items. First of all, if our audio is transmitting, find the chat box and let us know where you're tuning in from. That lets us know that one, you found the chat box, and two, that you can hear our audio coming in. If you can't hear the audio, and I've heard that occasionally if you're tuning in on a mobile device that it starts muted, so you just need to find the speaker and unmute it if you're tuning in from a mobile device. If you found the chat box that's on the right side, then up towards the top, you should see a small section labeled Q&A. You can ask your questions there, and we will do our best to respond to them throughout the webinar. I'm actually going to be off camera responding to questions as this goes on. And then if there's any questions that I don't know the answer to or that I think the entire audience would benefit from, I'll hold those to the end, and I'll ask those of Chris once we make it to the end. You can ask questions in the chat thread, but it's a little bit clunky in responding back and forth in that chat thread. So there at times we might convert something over to the Q&A section just so it's a little bit easier for you to read our responses and to have a back and forth as we go and make sure that we're completely answering your question. Now, probably the number one question that we get whenever we hold a webinar is, will this be recorded and will this be recorded? Those are the top questions that we always get. And the answer is yes, this will be recorded. We'll be sending out a recording to everyone that registered. So if you have to leave early, we understand. We want to make sure that you still have the content to benefit from. So don't worry, if you've registered, we will be sending out a recording to this. So that's the housekeeping for the day. If you have any issues as far as the stream cuts out or anything, easiest thing to do is just to refresh and to rejoin. If that doesn't work, then go ahead and ping myself in the chat, and I'll do everything I can to get you back up and running so that you can participate. So housekeeping out of the way. Today, as I mentioned, we're talking customer WordPress website migration. So just to break it down in the chapters, we're going to be talking about planning and prepping to migrate a website, then setting expectations with your customers, and then a couple tricks and tips on actually performing the migration, and then just some post-migration maintenance to make sure that everything has gone smoothly. Again, as I mentioned before, if someone's paying you for a service like a migration, they have an expectation, and we want to help them meet that expectation. And then we'll conclude with a client handoff, any questions that you should be asking yourself or them, and making sure that everyone is on the same page when you hand the keys over to that newly migrated website. And then, as I mentioned before, we'll finish off with a Q&A. So without any further ado, I will pass the time over to you, Chris. And as I mentioned before, I'll be going off screen to try to answer as many of your questions as possible. And I will be back at the end for Q&A. So Chris, take it away.
Cool. So yeah, starting out with just planning and prep, there's a few things you want to do before you start, right? So imagining here that you've got some client websites that need to be migrated. What are the things you need to be thinking about ahead of time? So the first thing you're going to want to do is start gathering data. Your job, first and foremost, when you're first getting started, is to be a detective. Because usually when you're working with clients, particularly when you're working with clients that aren't as familiar with how websites and some of those things work, which is common, you're going to have to figure out not just what the customer is asking you for, but also everything else that the customer didn't know that they should be asking you. And we'll go into like what some of those things might be. So the sort of resources and information that you need to be finding out requires a lot of asking questions. So think about it like this. A really good analogy I like to use um, for when you're doing a website migration is to think of it similar to when you're moving from one apartment to another apartment, or you're moving across town, or you're moving to another state, right? If you've got to pack up all of your stuff and figure out the logistics of all of these things, and you know ship everything or get a U-Haul or what all those things you have to do, there's a lot of parallels to the sort of planning that you're going to want to do here. um, so the main thing that you want to do in your first step is find out what is it exactly that your client is expecting when you're doing migrations, because it might seem straightforward at first to think like, oh well, I'm going to take this website and I'm going to migrate it to the same URL at a different hosting provider, or a different URL at a new hosting provider, or whatever it is. Or maybe you're just moving it between accounts at the same hosting provider. But whatever you're doing there, consider the fact that maybe your client doesn't necessarily think about the scope of what a website is in the same way that you do, particularly if your client isn't as familiar with how everything works. So, if something like the hosting versus where the domain name is registered, um, some of those boundaries aren't going to necessarily be really obvious. Where the website might be hosted at some hosting provider, the domain name might also be hosted, might be registered there, might be registered elsewhere, right? But don't necessarily assume. It's important that you find out or do a who is lookup, and definitely determine, um, does your client even have access to it? There's been cases where I've helped out clients before, back when I did client work, and come to find out they don't even really have access to the domain name. Their previous web person set it up, and since everything still worked, they just assumed they had access to everything when it turns out they really didn't. So figure out, where are things hosted, where is the domain name registered, and what sort of kind of peripheral subscriptions and things like that also exist. Imagine that your customer has a mailing list or something like that, where there's a little pop-up that comes up on the website that says please sign up for the mailing list. Your client might think of that as part of the website, and you might not. So it's important you have these sorts of conversations and find out what exactly is moving, what is staying the same. um, Email accounts, for example. We're not really going to be talking much about email today, but it's something to make sure that you've set up, um, that you've talked about. Is there email here that we need to worry about? Is there server email we need to find a migration path for? That sort of thing. Making sure that you have the right kind of access, that you have access to the hosting, to the DNS, to everything that you need there. Um, and making sure that you have good contacts around everyone who currently has access, or people you might contact if things go wrong. Think of it like, the sort of phone numbers that traditionally you give the babysitter, of like, oh, call this number, here's this number, here's this number, or it might just be call me if anything at all goes wrong, that sort of thing. But like, those are the sorts of things you need to be doing for this, where you find out, okay, well, who was the previous web person, or maybe it was you, or who set up this website, or, who are the sorts of people that you need to be in touch with to make sure that, oh, I need to update the DNS in a hurry. Who do I call for that? Do I have the right access for it? That sort of stuff. So at first, you're just gathering all of that information into a big old document so that you're sure to have everything. Assess complexity and risks. This is when you might look out at everything that you're going to do and try and figure out what might go wrong. Where is your risk going to be? What are things that are either you've never done before, maybe, or what are things that you're less familiar with? Um, if you're moving between two different hosting environments, are those hosting environments the same or are they different? Do you have, um, a lot of times when you're migrating a site, if you're changing hosting providers, there's differences between them. Sometimes those differences are the reason you're moving. Maybe you're, moving off of something onto something that's more powerful or something that might work differently. So try to figure out what are the sorts of things that are likely to go wrong. Um, the analogy of, do you have the right phone numbers on the fridge? Do you have a way to get in touch with both the old and the new hosting provider if you need to? Um, if sometimes you'll find that there's certain things might need updating before you even move anything. If I helped with a migration once where one of the reasons we were moving was we were stuck on a very old version of PHP that was holding back updates of certain plugins. And so that was one of the things we had to figure out was, okay, how do we can't feasibly update this before we switch over, which made things a little more complicated. So the point here is just try and figure out where that risk is going to be. You don't necessarily have to solve all of it up front. It's great if you can, but you don't necessarily have to solve everything up front. But it is very important that you try to make yourself aware of where the risk lies so that you're less surprised. So that you can say, okay, this is the part that's really tricky. This is the part that's going to be a breeze. And if you're right about that, then you'll know where to focus your attention. Choosing the right destination. So it might not be up to you, or it might be up to you to figure out where the destination of a migration is going to be. It might be on you as the agency person to decide, we're going to use this hosting provider versus that hosting provider. Or another thing that's very, very common with agencies and web pros is to consolidate things under known accounts. Sometimes it can be like a big hassle if you're like, okay, well, each one of my clients has a different hosting environment and has different people that they pay on different billing cycles, and it's complicated and annoying. A lot of people don't like dealing with that. And so they'll just sort of work it into the agreement that, like, hey, if I'm going to watch after your website, then you need to be a part of whatever systems or planning or process that I do. So, like, I need you to move over to this hosting account that I maintain, or, depending on what you have set up. But it might be worth it, especially if it's in the customer's best interest, to try and influence them toward what you believe is best based on their needs, based on what makes sense for your ability to scale. Because if you're doing yourself a favor by consolidating or making sure that you have systems and standards around, and we'll talk about more about that later, but making sure that you have systems and standards for things. If you're doing yourself a favor by making it easy to maintain, by making it so that you don't have these endless lists and all these differences between clients, you're doing your clients a favor too. If you're doing yourself a favor, and you're doing your clients a favor, because that means you've got more time to focus on their needs, more time to focus on communication, to take on more clients, whatever it is that you need, given that, there's less risk if you're able to make things kind of uniform in that way. And you're going to be able to do a better job at making sure, good uptime, good support, those sorts of things, if you don't have to teach and manage a million different things. So if it is a situation where you do get to influence the client on the destination, then terrific. And try to pick the right one. Pick a hosting provider that's going to be able to scale with you, right? I'm obviously going to be a little biased for Bluehost since I work at Bluehost, but Bluehost has some great entry level stuff, and we also have Bluehost Cloud, which is capable of handling high traffic websites and big e-commerce websites. It's so it doesn't have to be Bluehost, obviously, but just consider the needs of your client when you're doing that, and make sure that if you're going through all of the effort for a migration, that it's going to be worth it. That it's a good spot to be. So going back to that was planning and prep, and we're going to talk about setting expectations. So all right, let's talk about setting expectations with your client. This is maybe one of the most important steps when you're dealing with clients, in my experience. Part of that is just that you want to make sure that your client's definition of what you're doing and your definition of what you're doing is the same. That you understand, hey, I'm going to be taking on these responsibilities and not these responsibilities. I really like the analogy of moving, where sometimes you do hire movers or something, or people can hire movers. And it's good to understand, okay, am I putting things in boxes or are you putting things in boxes? Okay, so I get them in boxes, but you pack the truck and drive the truck, or do I have to drive the truck? Those sorts of things. Same thing is true of these, to where a client might not know what to expect. They might not know how much of this you have to do, and they might have expectations that are going to be really important to talk about ahead of time. So, like if they have some email list that they also just assume is going to be migrated, or they think, oh, I won't have to pay for this anymore when I move it over here. Just make sure that they understand what it is you're going to do. And that comes down to things like price, how long things are going to take, at what point you'll do certain things. Downtime is an important one. Ideally, you can set it up such that there shouldn't be a whole lot of downtime. Maybe no downtime at all, depending on a few factors about the site. And we'll talk about some different ways you can do that. But the idea being that even if there's a situation where there does need to be a little bit of downtime, or a little bit of, hey, let me shut down sales on my old site and turn on sales on the new site, and point DNS or something like that, that whatever the situation is there, that if you've expressed it to your customer and you've agreed ahead of time, oftentimes with good communication, your client will be willing to negotiate on something reasonable, right? But it's very, very important that those things are set up front, because what you don't want is you don't want it to be a surprise halfway through the process that, oh yeah, your site might be down for 5 minutes while we issue a new SSL, or oh yeah, we need to pick a time that is low traffic or something like that, and then your client is thinking, wait, we never talked about this before, or and set migration goals together. I usually do this on a call with a client, where we will outline line by line, here's everything that's going to be true by the end of this. By the end of this, you're going to have this, this is going to look this way, this is going to be here, you'll be able to do this, you'll be able to do that sort of thing. So yeah, set expectations. One of the things to make sure when you're talking about those goals and you're kind of going through that checklist that you can define together, depending on how many migrations you're going to do, or if this is going to be a regular thing for your agency, it's oftentimes a good idea to come up with a checklist and then save that for the next time you have a client, so that you can say, oh, you know what? We've actually already done these sorts of things before. And every now and then you might learn something new might go wrong, and that checklist will get a little longer. And the longer you've been doing client stuff, that checklist will get longer and longer and longer as you realize, okay, or you might trim some things off. But the point being that, like, with more experience, you're going to find there might be more things you have to think through. But a great way to get aligned on this sort of communication is to have a good checklist that you can go through and say, okay, here's when we're doing the migration itself. Here's when we're turning off sales on the old website. Here's when we're, or whatever it is that you have to do, whatever your process is. And we'll talk about different ways to do the migration itself. But checklists are good. Do checklists. Next, we've got actually performing the migration itself. So this is where you're actually doing it. Um, Here are some things you should keep in mind. There's more than one way to do a migration, particularly when we're talking about WordPress migrations. The great thing and the annoying thing about WordPress is there's often more than one way to do just about everything. And so when you're kind of picking your migration method, think about what sort of limitations you're going to be under. By that, I mean, you might find with a migration that you don't have the level of access that you want. There might be times when all you can do is get WP admin access, and you have to figure out a way to do a migration there. And Bluehost has a really good migration solution where all you really need is an admin login to WP admin, and you're able to copy over a site. But there's different options out there. Sometimes people really prefer to do things manually over command line with MySQL and rsync and moving files over and things like that. So depending on what level of access you have, what limitations you're under, you might have to pick a different method than what you're normally used to. There was a host that I helped with a migration on that this wasn't a common host that you would have heard of, but this was just somebody running their own server basically. And there was a whole bunch of sort of access level tools that weren't there. And it made it really, really tricky that I couldn't just log into the server and push some files over. We had to really kind of figure out a roundabout way to do it because the disk on the server was almost full, and we had to figure out how are we going to copy this stuff off? How are we going to do this? And I had to do a very different, took longer, required a little bit more downtime migration method on this low space disk, low CPU server to get off of it. And it wasn't great, but we figured it out. So just figure that out. What limitations do you have? Hopefully none. Translation and transformation. By that, what I mean is it going to be identical when you're done? Sometimes that is the case, and it's often easier when that's the case, but not always. Sometimes you'll find that we're going to make a copy of the site, and the copy of the site will be at a different URL, and then we're going to change the URL and point DNS when we're done. Or sometimes clients will try to do other things during the migration and say, hey, while you're migrating it, can you also update it to the latest version? And maybe that's the reason you're leaving your old host is, oh, I can't run the latest version of a plugin that I like because of PHP or something like that. Or even if it's old enough, the latest version of WordPress core or something. So figure out, these are things that will influence how you can migrate. Is this a one-to-one copy? Or do I have to change and transform this site as a part of the migration? But usually the easiest way to do it is to make a copy of the site at your destination and then make whatever changes are necessary at that copy, and then make your copy the real website and point over DNS. If there's a whole bunch of changes happening live or a whole bunch of comments, or it's a live e-commerce website, there's some ways that you might have to consider taking the site, pausing sales on the old site, or you might consider something a little bit more complex where sales data is immutable, and you don't have to worry about that as much. But depending on what your limitations are and how you're transferring, just consider that while you're picking out, do I use this plugin or that plugin? Do I log into the server and use SSH? Do I, what do you have? I'll move on to this after this, but another example of a limitation is sometimes you don't even get a live website when you start. Sometimes you'll have a client that just says, hey, my web developer left and went no contact, and all I have is a zip file. Can you figure out what this is and turn it into a website and migrate it somewhere? You're like, okay, now I got to figure out what to do with this. So it's just things to think about when you're picking how you want to migrate. Bluehost does have a great migration method if you do have two live websites and you just want to move one over to another. Uptime monitoring. This is a good thing to do just generally. Don't wait for migrations to do it. But it's especially important for migrations just because if something goes wrong, you want to make sure that you know about it, ideally before your client, or maybe at the same time, given that if you can hook that up before you start migrating, you can save yourself a lot of hassle. DNS is the thing that the internet uses to decide where a domain name is pointed. So if you're pointing your website DNS at one host versus another host, if the URL of the site isn't changing when you do your migration, there's a good chance you'll have to change your DNS. There's a good chance you don't have to change domain registration, but you can. And some people like to. And SSL is something that's when your site is HTTPS, that's because there's an SSL certificate installed in the host. Depending on what level of downtime is acceptable or appropriate, usually it doesn't take more than a few minutes to issue an SSL with most competent hosting providers. But if having even just a few minutes of downtime is too much, you can try to go and install an SSL on your destination site ahead of time using the right URL so that you can get to a kind of a no downtime state. And usually your hosting provider can help you with that. Make sure that you move over your files, your database, and your plugins, right? Those are kind of the key components of a WordPress site. You might have to set up a new environment. Depending on the host that you're using, maybe that's all automated. But if it's not, you might have to set it up. Testing and verification is just, does everything work? One of the things you're probably going to want to do when you're figuring out that checklist with your customer is to talk to them and find out what are the things about this website that are important. And you can step through this with them of what matters to you the most about this website? And maybe it's just, it's downtime. It's all I care about is no downtime. Or maybe it's, hey, I actually don't care as long as we do it in the middle of the night when nobody's going to be looking at the site anyway. And I just don't do it during, Black Friday or something, or whatever it is. But if you plan out ahead of time, these are the pieces of functionality that are really, really important that they work before and after. You can kind of bake that into your plan so that before you cut over DNS, so before if you just make a copy of the site and on that copy, it's at a different URL, you can test stuff. Think of it like a staging site, but at your destination. And whatever it is that you talked about with your client, test it. If it's a store, do a transaction, right? Make a $1 product and buy it, see if it works. Step through the parts of the website that matter. One thing, and I think we'll talk about it a little bit more later, one thing that's often really important to consider is do redirects still work, right? Are there a bunch of complicated redirects that you have to make sure? Sometimes redirects are set up in WordPress itself, like Yoast Premium will automatically set up redirects when you when posts change URLs or when you update things like that. So it's really handy. And then it kind of lives in the WordPress layer. But a lot of times people have their redirects set up in such a way that it's installed kind of at the hosting level, not at the application level. And if that's the case and you're moving hosts, you might have to figure out how redirects are different at your new hosting provider and log into some kind of control panel or tool that lets you set that up. So testing and verification is really just, does everything still work? Do the pictures show up? Does everything look right? Do the fonts look right? Or is it suddenly the fonts look different and broken? You can open up your browser console by right-clicking on anything on the page and clicking Inspect in Chrome. And then just see if there's new or different errors in the console. Those are the sorts of things you can do to see, Generally speaking, does this look right? Is everything okay? So yeah. Post-migration tasks. So this is after you've performed the migration, not necessarily before you've switched over the DNS to point to the new host, assuming it's different. But just things to do kind of as last steps. Double check those redirects, like we talked about. Make sure they're good. A lot of times people have caching plugins, and a lot of times caching plugins are specific to a host, where there's a Bluehost caching plugin, there's some other company caching plugin, or whatever, or maybe it's just specific to a server or something. But given that that might change, it's worth it to think through and to think, okay, do I need to clear the cache? Is everything good? Permalinks are a setting right there in WP admin where you can go in and say settings, permalinks, save changes. If you just do that, settings, permalinks, save changes, it will recreate all of the kind of pathways on the server to allow links to load properly. So if after a migration you find that every page except for the home page is a 404, just go into settings, permalinks, save changes, and see if that fixes it. Backups. Backups are a thing that are often tied to the hosting environment in some way. Make sure they still work. Make sure that whatever your destination is, that you have backups. Good to test it too. Perform a small restore. You don't want the first time you do a restore to be the time that you're figuring out how restores work, right? Prepare documentation as needed. This is a great thing to do. Make sure is good near the end. If you're consolidating people onto a new host or onto a large, 10 or 20 website hosting account or something, if you're doing that, sometimes you have to create less documentation because you can reuse stuff. And you can, here's our new client onboarding, where you can kind of show people, here's how you log into this, here's how you do this. And depending on the sort of level of control that you give to clients, you might have to do more or less documentation. But if you're managing all of the hosting for them, maybe you don't have to document all of that much at all. But anything that changes, anything that's new or different, give them the access they need. And so just something to consider is, after a migration, hey, is there anything new I should be documenting for them? Do they log in to their, to anything a little differently? Is suddenly, if it's a different caching plugin, maybe it clears differently or something, just little differences like that. Troubleshooting common issues. When you're migrating a site, a lot of things can go wrong. Some of the more common things are, if you're, depending on what kind of plugin you're using, some migration plugins will try to make a whole copy of the site on the source before it pushes everything over to the destination. And sometimes they'll run out of space. So if you're doing that, you might want to try and find a solution that doesn't do that. Luckily, the Bluehost plugin doesn't really have that problem anymore. We've recently revamped kind of how that works, and it works a lot better. Another really common thing is, if your URLs are changing, you might find that certain things don't load. So you might have to do a search and replace in the WordPress database. That's really easy to do over WP CLI, over command line. If you're familiar with the command line, it's great to do. If you're not, sometimes your host can help you. There's also really good plugins that just do search and replace that you can find. Sometimes that's necessary for if the URL is different at your destination, either permanently or temporarily. Another thing to watch out for is, if suddenly you've got a lot of 404s, flush permalinks by going into settings, permalinks, save changes. That definitely helps. Going back to our list, if some images load and some don't, take a look at the URL and see if you can figure out what's wrong. Figure out what the URL is that it's trying to load and open that in a new tab. You might find that the way that file names are processed might be a little different if you've got non-Latin characters in file names. Um, you might find that certain hosting providers are very opinionated about folder structure, and that some folder that used to be called this is now called that. If you're using just kind of a default pattern for your folder names in WordPress, it shouldn't be too much of a problem. But if that has been customized, like some people will change the name of WP admin, the folder, or something like that. Sometimes that can get really tricky. Security plugins sometimes will be a little bit temperamental when you migrate between sites. Anything that has a license key is really, really common for any paid kind of premium plugins to use the URL of a website to tell one website apart from another. Jetpack does this. A lot of plugins do this, and so they might throw an error at you and say, "Hey, this looks like a copy of the site. Is this the real one, or is this a copy? What should we do?" Just something to check for. But yeah, click around and see what you can find. A lot of times, if you can get an error message or an error code, you can search that on Google and find, hey, after migration, this broke. Hey, after migration, that broke. Going back to our outline. So that was post-migration maintenance. Let's talk a little bit about client handoff. So this is once you've done the migration, once everything's working, once everything's good, and you think you're done, talking about that with your client, going over everything with your client. If you remember back when we had that checklist we talked about, that's a great time to go through that checklist with your client and say, all right, here's everything we did. And you kind of show them everything that you did. So at that point is a good time. Remember the documentation that we talked about? It'd be great to go over that with clients, train them on anything new, different. Maybe they have to log in a new place. Maybe before they had to do something that no longer they have to do. Make sure they have access to whatever it is that they need. Access handoff itself can be a little bit tricky. So try to do it safely. It's usually not a very good idea to email passwords because passwords are often stored in plain text. And so even if your email account is safe, you're relying on both your email and your client's email to never get hacked anytime in the future. So there's ways you can pass passwords back and forth. Password managers often have ways to do this. I personally like to use 1Password. It's great. Or using short expiry paste bins where you paste something in, you send someone a link, and then that link will kind of self-destruct after a little while. After handing off a site for migration, that's a really good time to talk about like ongoing support that you can give, especially if you're an agency looking for kind of recurring revenue. This is when it's often a good idea to talk about a maintenance package if you haven't already. Sometimes that's sort of the start of the conversation is, hey, here's our maintenance package. And step one of this is we're going to move you over to how I host websites so that we can control this better and we can, build you into our systems. You're going to be a lot better off if you can not be solving everything every time. If you can create a process, if you can create a system for everything so that you host all of your clients the same way, that when you go through and you figure out how to do WordPress updates, that you're doing that the same way for everybody. If you have to reinvent everything for every one of your clients, that makes it really tough because that means to get more, to grow your business, you have to grow your effort and you have to grow your expenditure of time or clientele in a kind of linear way. What you want to be able to do is have systems in place so that you can add customers to your business, and that doesn't directly double or triple the amount of work that you have to do. Because now you're saying, well, no, I'm just going to add another website to my collection of websites that all get maintained exactly in the same way. And so a maintenance package is great for a customer because they can kind of sit back and, okay, you're taking care of all of these things. It's great for you because it gives you some ongoing um, revenue that you can do, and helps kind of standardize, put things um, into systems and things like that. Um, so yeah, a maintenance package is great as a way to charge money, and oftentimes migrations are just like a first step into that. That's how you kind of onboard people. Next, cool. So before we get into the Q&A, by the way, I just want to really quickly recap some of the things that we've talked about already. So planning and prep, that's when you're gathering information, right? That's when you're finding out where are things hosted, where's the domain name registration, what accounts are there, what does the client expect, is there email I need to worry about, is there, and how am I going to do this migration? Do I just use the same plugin I always use? Do I have to do something weird and different? Am I just going to make a copy of the site and then update that copy to be the real site? Is that how I'm doing the migration, or do I have something else? Set expectations. That's going through line by line with your client and saying, here's exactly what we're going to do. Here are all the things we don't cover. Making sure that you have the same definitions for things. Performing the migration itself. Hopefully that's pretty simple. We've got a good solution for this at Bluehost. But depending on what your process is, the best migration solution is the one that works for you, the one you're comfortable with, the one that you can scale, right? And so similar to backups, it's what works for you. It's what helps you get the job done is the best one. Post-migration maintenance, that's when you're doing a lot of testing, you're doing a lot of last-minute upgrades, you're double-checking that links are good, you're flushing permalinks, which we talked about how to do. You're making sure that are the URLs correct? Is the canonical URL correct? All of these different things. Maybe you've got to flush some cache here or there, or swap out this plugin for that plugin. But everything that happens kind of at the end. Client handoff. That's when you go through and you kind of show off your work to your client. And you say, okay, here's everything we did. Here's the keys to log into the new WordPress. We changed the password for you or whatever it is. Here's where, if you have to do email migrations, which hopefully you don't, but if you do, we moved you off of some server email into Google Apps or Office 365 or whatever it is you did, right? Make sure they have access to everything. Make sure everything's good. Go over all of the things that exist with them so that they understand that, like, you've got a domain name here, you've got DNS here, you've got hosting here, you've got a MailChimp account or a Constant Contact account over here, you've got some other plugin, all of their subscriptions or whatever. Make sure that they understand as you're either handing those things off, or maybe they're handing them off to you, right? It depends on what kind of services you're offering. And those are some of the main considerations when, as an agency, you're handling migrations. So hopefully that was helpful. Let's jump into Q&A. I do see we've got some questions come in.
I think we do. Can you hear me okay? Am I back?
Yes, we can hear you.
All right, let me take a look at the questions that we have. We got a handful of questions here and a little bit of time to get through them. Thank you, first of all, Chris, for walking us through that. Very informative, as always. I really appreciate your guidance and your expertise on this matter. So jumping into the first question I wanted to ask you, someone said, if my client is a little bit hesitant, how do I help convince my client that they need to migrate their website?
Okay. So it sounds like in this case, it's a scenario where the client isn't coming to you saying, can you migrate me out? This is a case where you're saying, as the agency, person, hey, we need to put you on our hosting. Um, this is this is when it's good to have a conversation about um, like some kind of maintenance package of like, hey, here's what we're going to be offering you. Your client doesn't necessarily have to understand it the same way that you do. They don't have to know everything. They mostly just have to trust you. But in order to gain that trust with them, it requires some communication and maybe a little bit of sales pitching into here's why it's worth it for you to get off of this hosting package that you're on and onto mine. Maybe some of that is price, maybe some of that is levels of access, but at the end of the day, often the best reason to standardize is so that you can build systems and you can promise your clients you're going to have better uptime, you're going to have better support if if my people and the people that work for me are familiar with this. You don't want um, you don't want there to be something new that you have to learn every time something goes wrong. So, take that customer on the journey with you so that they understand that like standardization and getting kind of systems and patterns and habits in place for this stuff is good. It's good for you, it's good for the client. Hopefully that helps a little bit.
Yeah, I think that's a great answer, and I would just add, I think with a small analogy is just kind of like car maintenance, right? Where it's like if someone it's like helping someone understand the value of getting their oil changed, It's like, "Well, hold on, you wanna charge me $100? Like, my car is still running fine." Like, it is currently, but if you don't take these preventative actions, which are gonna cost a little bit now, then it's gonna incur a lot more of expensive problems
Yeah.
later down the road. So, sometimes by migrating your customer's website to a new environment, you might be able to get them more resources. You might be able to get them a lower cost in hosting, and maybe both for all we know.
Right.
So yeah, I think just helping them understand the values and the benefit for them is absolutely key in that. That actually segues perfectly into the next question, which is: are there any specific hosting providers or platforms that you recommend for seamless WordPress migrations?
Yeah. Yeah. This one right here, Bluehost. Um, what works for you, honestly, is the real answer. Um, Figure out what you're able to scale. Figure out what works well for what your needs are. Obviously, I've used Bluehost for a long time. I work at Bluehost, um, but it's going to be different depending on your needs, right? And make sure that you've got a hosting provider that is competent in WordPress, that has a lot of experience in WordPress, has been there since basically the beginning, that is able to grow with you. Something that, if one of your sites really takes off and you need to upgrade to something extremely powerful, that you've got people that you can call in the middle of the night that can do that, right? So like that's the sort of thing you'll get with Bluehost, and a lot of other hosts offer things like that too. But you know, make sure it's solving your problem and that you're comfortable with it and you trust them. That's the main thing. That's what we're shooting for at Bluehost. And I think we do a pretty good job. But what specific providers can I recommend that do a good job at migrations? Bluehost does a great job, but so would basically any competent WordPress host.
Cool. Let's go to the next question. We talked a little bit about timeline. This question is: how do I know how long something is going to take ahead of time as far as the migration goes? And so how do
Yeah.
I effectively plan for that and convey that timeline to my client?
Well, um, more experience you have with specific problems, the better you can estimate. But the more prepared you are for those. Remember, we talked about figure out what the risks are, figure out where the difficult parts are and where the easy parts are going to be. The more accurate that is, the better your estimates are going to be. And if you can break it down into individual discrete steps, then hopefully you can come up with a plan where you can say, hey, here's when I'm going to make the copy. Hey, here's when we're going to cut over DNS. Here, if you do see problems, it's going to be here, not here, that sort of thing. Um, but yeah, sometimes you just have to make your best guess if it's something you're not familiar with. And if it's a new or difficult problem that you haven't solved before, give yourself a little bit of extra breathing room to figure out, oh geez, I've got to migrate off of a host I've never dealt with before and it's unfamiliar. Maybe it's in another language even. Um, that can sometimes be tricky. So like give yourself a little extra room if you think you're going to need it.
Yeah, and I really like what you said about kind of going through the access, with your client before you lay out the timeline. Make sure, like, hey, do you have access to your email, to your website, to your DNS? Like, because I feel like those sometimes are the things that can take a little bit of time. I mean, any step along the way can extend the timeline, but if they don't have that access and they're like, well, I thought that this person had it, and then they have to chase it down. I think, getting all of that stuff up front, making sure your ducks are all lined up in a row, that can help streamline the overall process immensely, I think.
Yes.
Okay. Next question that we have. Let's see. What strategies do you recommend for testing website functionality and performance post migration? I think that's a great question. Before you hand the keys over and say, hey, this thing's ready, as an agency, what strategies or tools do you suggest?
Um, what I like to call this is critical path testing and user acceptance testing. So, critical path is what are the things that are really important? So, for an e commerce website, it's things like, are the prices correct? Can I check out? Can I go from, you know, the home page to the sales page to the cart to checkout? Can I go to the login page and log in? Like, document what are those paths? What are those critical paths that you have to go through and make sure they're good? Critical path testing. The other thing is user acceptance testing, which is it's also perfectly fine and appropriate even um, if you perform the migration by making a copy of the website at the destination at a different URL. It's totally fine and appropriate to give your client access to that copy and say, hey, you tell me if this looks okay. Um, and obviously, you want to do your testing ahead of time and make sure that everything's good and you're not throwing too much at them or whatever. But like the sometimes they might find things you don't find, or we call it user acceptance testing. Like, hey, is this good enough? Do you accept where we're at, or do you see something wrong that we should address? And then they can kind of sign off for you and say, yeah, it looks good to me. Let's do the rest. And then that's you can go ahead and change the domain at that point.
Yeah. What are your thoughts about using something like GT metrics or like a waterfall performance test before and after the migration, just to kind of be like, yeah, okay, we're seeing performance improvement, especially if you're selling it to your client as, hey, once we do this migration, you're going to see X amount improvement. Do you think there's any benefit to that?
There can be. It depends on the kind of speed you're going for. The Sometimes when it comes to high traffic sites, speed is important. Obviously, it's very important for SEO, for the user experience, but it's equally important scalability, which is not
Mm,
a thing you can easily test for with something like GT metrics.
right.
Difference between speed and scalability is speed is how fast it loads once. Scalability is it the same speed if 100 people do that at once,
Right.
right?
Right.
And so you can definitely point at something and say, "Hey, look, this one's a little bit faster than the other one," and that's terrific if that's true. But one of the things that's often true when you're moving things to a powerful and scalable hosting provider is you might not necessarily see a huge difference in the page speed load. You might see the biggest difference in scalability. So, depending on where you think you'll see those benefits, those gains, it might be valuable to show that to your client,
Okay.
or it might be equivalent in both
Right.
places and it's more
Right.
about standardization. So it really depends. If you think it's worth showing off, show it off. If it's
Right.
not show offable, skip it.
Since my brain always thinks in analogies, the one that comes to my mind is a 2-lane highway versus like a 6 or an 8-lane highway. Like, you could probably drive about the same speed down both of them as a single car, but if you need to move 40,000 cars during rush hour, the 8-lane highway is going to be able to do that a lot more effectively than a 2-lane highway for sure.
Sure.
Um, cool. Okay. Next question that
Or
we
a
have
bus
on here,
or a
and
train,
what's that?
yeah. Or like a bus or a train, yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Analogy.
Got a few more questions, and I know we're coming up on time quick, so I'm going to try to go through these relatively quickly. How can an agency ensure a smooth transition for an e-commerce website during migration to prevent loss of sales and customer data?
There's a couple ways you can do that. So one way is to make a copy of the site and then just move over the sales data at the very, very end. It's oftentimes worth it to shut down sales on the old site and turn it on the new site. And sometimes that's intentional downtime. Even if the website's not down, you might see people that are getting the copy of the website in their browser that doesn't take sales for 10 minutes while it updates. Depending on the type of site it is, what kind of traffic you get, you can mitigate some of that. If it's a site where, hey, we're getting lots of individual small sales all the time, that's really tricky because it's just a function of time is money. If it's more like, oh, I only get a few sales, but they're big money sales every time, then maybe 10 minutes here or there isn't the worst thing in the world. It really
Right.
just depends. And the sometimes you can do it at a time of day or a time of the week when you and your client anticipate less traffic. Maybe the middle of the night on a weekday or a weekend or something is the best time to make that cutover. Or maybe, it really just depends on what it is that you're
Sure.
doing.
Okay. Next question that I have here is, what role does website caching play in the migration process, and how should it be managed to avoid issues?
Um, when you're making a copy of your site, it should include the plugins. One thing that's sometimes tricky about that is oftentimes you're going to want something application layer like a plugin to manage caching. You're going to want to make sure that you've got a good caching plugin that's automatically purging the cache when things update with the site, like the Bluehost plugin does. So if you're migrating between hosting providers, sometimes that can be tricky. That like, oh, the caching plugin of this other server is now on this other server over here, and they're different hosting environments. So because of that, that's maybe something you have to watch out for and say, oh, well, this is the old one. I can delete it now, or something like that. But as long as you're able to clear the cache, both the old and the new one, it should be fine. If you're using a CDN in between the site and the like an edge layer like Cloudflare, sometimes it's a good idea to clear that after a migration just to make sure that you're really seeing the latest thing. CDN is content delivery network, so anything like that. But yeah, as long as you can clear the cache and you're not moving over plugins that don't need to be moved over, should be fine.
Awesome. Okay, rapid fire round. Just a few more questions. How do you handle migrations from something that isn't WordPress to something that is WordPress?
Well, at that point, is more than a migration; it's a conversion. You're converting a site from something that isn't WordPress to WordPress. A lot of times, that just requires rebuilding the site, but in WordPress. That's more than a migration. That's you make a whole website,
Right.
and so that's a whole nother thing. But oftentimes it happens, and oftentimes building into systems and building into something you can scale, it's sometimes worth it. But yeah, at that point, it's not even really a migration; it's a conversion. I'm going to make you a new website that looks like your old one now on WordPress.
Right. Okay. Next question. How do I move a site between WordPress versions or PHP versions?
Oof, ideally, you don't have to, but if you do, try to change as many things of those types of things as you can on the source, as long as you can be confident it doesn't break anything. The less that has to change, the better. But if you can't, or if you're worried about downtime, make a copy of the site, like a staging copy, and then change it on the staging copy, make sure it's okay. And depending on your migration, that's actually the most popular way to do migrations is you make a copy at the destination, make whatever changes you need, like upgrading WordPress versions or whatever, and then make sure everything still works.
Okay, awesome. I advanced to the next slide just as we're finishing up. This is just a few other helplines. If you'd like any further assistance from Bluehost, we want to be here to help you with your website building journey for you or your clients as we're moving forward. And also, as we ask one or two more final questions, the question I'd like to ask of everyone that's still tuned in, if you have any topics that you'd like us to cover in the future, we want these to be educational and engaging for everyone that's tuning in. So if you have anything that you'd like to see us cover, please drop that in the chat. We'll try to do the best we can to get that as a future webinar. But closing, I think we got time for maybe one or two more questions.
Okay.
How can we ensure that email service is not disrupted during a domain transfer?
Yeah. So far we've just been talking about websites. Email is kind of its own topic of itself. But the way that DNS works is you've got certain records on a domain name that say, here's where the website is pointed. And you've got certain separate records for here's where the email is pointed. And so as long as you're very careful, if your email host doesn't change, then you don't have to change the DNS record for your email host. So just be very careful that you're not accidentally or inadvertently updating the email DNS records. So as long as those stay pointed to, Google Apps, it's called Google Workspace now, or Office 365, or wherever it is that it's hosted, it should be fine. But email hosting and website hosting are often separate concerns, and if you can keep them separate, you'll have less headaches. By the way, Bluehost does have an email migration service if you don't want to worry about that, and they will help you with things like that. I just always recommend use Google Apps, use Microsoft Office.
Yeah.
Self-hosting email is a nightmare. Don't do it if you can help it.
It can be tricky for sure. Okay, last question to end on. I migrated a website and it is behaving differently on the new destination compared to the old one. What things should I check out?
That's tough. That's one of the more tricky things. Look for differences in the hosting environment. Are you on a different PHP version? Is the PHP configuration different? If it's a redirect thing, find out if the redirects are managed in WordPress or if they're managed in the hosting environment. Lots of times it's a host thing. And so you might have to say, oh, well, I need to add all these old redirects that were on the old server on the new server in some control panel maybe. If it's just a plugin and it's not throwing errors on the old one, but it is on the new one, sometimes the host can help you. But especially if it's a new or different type of hosting environment, sometimes they can help you. But look for differences in PHP versions. Look for differences in plugin versions, WordPress core, PHP configuration, what's installed on the server if you have that level of access. Those are the sorts of things that can cause differences, and lots of times your host can help.
Cool. All right. Well, I think that brings us to time today. So, Chris, thank you again for stopping by. I really appreciate you sharing your knowledge and experience with us and sticking around for some questions at the end there. So, thank you. And thank you for everyone for tuning in. We really appreciate all of your contributions and the questions that you asked and your engagement. So, thank you for that. And thank you again, Chris.
Bye-bye.
Talk to you later. Bye.